What is fascism? The term is almost ubiquitous today. People left and right lob it at any sort of political project they don't like, which really harkens back to George Orwell's 1944 warning, right, that fascism had been rendered almost entirely meaningless, reduced to a swear word, more or less. Right? But fascism actually has a very precise, concrete meaning. I teach a class on fascism at Bennington College, a small liberal arts college in Vermont. And I started teaching this class in January of 2021 for no apparent reason. But I've taught it a number of times over the past 5 years or so. And one of the things I do when I teach this class is look for good online resources that I can use to complement lectures and readings and class discussion. And I've been really surprised by the lack of good online resources that try to unpack what fascism actually means. So I thought I'd take a few minutes and try to provide a definition and really unpack that definition. So the best definition of fascism that I've found comes from a 2021 work by Andreas Malm and the Zetkin Collective. And bear with me here because the definition that they offer is complex, it's wordy, but we're going to spend some time and really unpack it. Right? So the definition is as follows. They say fascism is a politics of palingenetic ultranationalism. It comes to the fore in a conjuncture of deep crisis, and if leading sections of the dominant class throw their weight behind it and hand it power, there ensues an exceptional regime of systematic violence against those identified as enemies of the nation. So again, this is complicated and wordy. What does this all mean? Let's take a few minutes and sort of unpack the constituent parts of this definition. So to start with, what do we mean by palingenetic ultranationalism? Palingenesis refers to rebirth. Right? There's a sense among fascists that the nation is dying and must be reborn. And what they mean by the nation is quite specific. The nation isn't just a group of people bound together through a shared commitment to democratic values and processes. Rather, the nation is a group of people bound together by a shared linkage to a common blood or a common soil, right? A common place. So palingenetic ultranationalism. The nation is dying and must be reborn. This is a definition that was offered by Roger Griffin, who's one of the leading figures in fascism studies. And Griffin calls this the fascist minimum, or he elsewhere refers to it as the mythic core of fascism. So fascist projects across time and space necessarily differ, right, in their sort of substantive content. But one thing that links them all together is this commitment to palingenetic ultranationalism. The second part of the definition is the presence of some sort of deep crisis. Right? And this deep crisis is one of the things that takes the ideas of palingenetic ultranationalism and allows them to really gain purchase among a sizable segment of the national polity. So historically, if we look back to the 1920s, say, these crises were simultaneously economic and geopolitical. World War I, for instance, had a huge impact. And one of the things that it did was that it normalized violence for a sizable segment of the population living in territories impacted by World War I. Certainly, it normalized violence for the soldiers who were fighting, but also many of the civilians who'd suffered the impacts of this violence. Stanley Payne, the historian, argues that World War I helped lead to the brutalization of political life. The impacts of the war, of course, were also linked with the economic crisis of the time. Clara Zetkin, in a 1923 speech that she gave or a report that she gave for the Third International, said that the war shattered the capitalist economy down to its foundations. And she said, as a consequence of the war and as a consequence of this economic crisis, many social layers, this is the terminology that she uses, not just the working class, not just the poor, but even people who had been part of what we would think of as the middle class or the upper middle class, had really suffered materially as a consequence of World War I. They were struggling to have their basic subsistence needs met. A third component of the definition is this idea that when faced with the presence of a socialist alternative that existed, or a communist alternative that existed in the 1920s, leading sections of the dominant class sort of threw their support behind fascism. The dominant class, the industrialists of the time, the traditional political and economic elites, they didn't like the fascists. They didn't like Mussolini or Hitler. They thought they were sort of uncouth and unpredictable, but they preferred them over, or they came to prefer them anyway, over the socialist alternative. Right? And finally, the fourth part of the definition is that once the fascists are in power, they undertake a systematic program of violence against those who are deemed enemies of the nation. At first, the socialists, the communists, eventually the social democrats, the labor unionists, certainly the Jews, eventually homosexuals, those who are deemed socially deviant in some way. And again, this notion of the enemy broadens over time. So eventually, it's anyone who questions, or is supposed to have questioned, the legitimacy of the regime, or the wisdom of the regime. Right. So this is the definition offered by Malm and the Zetkin Collective. And I'll just offer a few more points that sort of supplement or complement this definition. And the first we get by turning to Karl Polanyi, the great political economic historian. And Polanyi insists that if we want to understand fascism, we have to think globally. Right? That the scale of the problem cannot be understood by looking at the particularities of what was going on in Italy, or what was going on in Germany, or what was going on in Romania, or Japan, or anywhere else. He says the appearance of such a movement in the industrial countries of the globe, and even in a number of only slightly industrialized ones, should never have been ascribed to local causes, national mentalities, or historical backgrounds, as was so consistently done by contemporaries. He continues, the movement appeared in defeated countries like Bulgaria, and in victorious ones like Yugoslavia, in countries of northern temperament like Finland and Norway, and of southern temperament like Italy and Spain, in countries of Aryan race like England, Ireland, or Belgium, and non-Aryan race like Japan, Hungary, or Palestine, in countries of Catholic traditions like Portugal, and in Protestant ones like Holland, in soldierly communities like Prussia, and civilian ones like Austria, in old cultures like France, and new ones like the US and the Latin American countries. So Polanyi's argument was that to understand fascism, we have to think about the global structures that were responsible for producing it. And this, to him, has to do with the sort of breakdown of the international political order, the balance of power in the lead up to World War I. And it also has to do with the global realities of capitalism. Mm-hmm. A second point that I think is interesting. Fascism was ubiquitous in the 1920s, 30s, as Polanyi points out, but it only really becomes institutionalized in a serious way in countries with highly mobilized or highly developed civil societies. This is a point that the sociologist Dylan Riley makes in his book looking at the rise of fascism in Italy, Spain, and Romania. This is also a point that Peter Fritsch, the historian, makes in his book called Germans into Nazis. But there was a highly developed civil society in countries where fascism ended up really taking hold. You had trade unions, newspapers, and magazines of many different kinds, religious organizations, the proliferation of interest groups, and of course the development of mass political parties as well. One of the arguments that a number of scholars, including Clara Zetkin, who I mentioned previously, and Dylan Riley, a contemporary scholar, make, is that leftist parties at this time, so say socialist, social democratic parties, working within liberal democratic institutions, had failed to resolve the crises that we've talked about and to respond to the pressing material needs of people, needs that were being advanced by these civil society organizations. And this really opens the door for fascism to emerge by saying that the system has basically failed you. The socialist parties also have failed you. And we need a radically different alternative. Again, Zetkin argues that a lot of the responsibility for this lies with failures on the left. She says that the sympathy of many people for reform socialism, which existed, which was pretty widespread in many countries, was not deeply rooted. So as things turned out, the people lost their belief not only in the reformist leaders, but also in socialism itself. The socialists promised an easing of our burdens and suffering, plus many beautiful things, and a reshaping of society on the foundations of justice and democracy, the people said. But the top dogs and the rich carry on and rule with even more severity than before. Masses in their thousands streamed to fascism. It became an asylum for all the politically homeless, the socially uprooted, the destitute and disillusioned. And what they no longer hoped for from the revolutionary proletarian class, from socialism, they now hope to be achieved by the most able, strong, determined, and bold elements of every social class. All these forces must come together in a community, and this community for the fascists is the nation. Right? So with this sort of mood in mind, Dylan Riley argues that it's in this context that the democratic demands, and I'm quoting here, of civil society tend to develop against the regime of political parties and are often expressed as skepticism about all forms of political representation. The fascists take advantage of this. And this is sort of one key difference between fascism and your sort of run-of-the-mill authoritarianism. The balance between consent and coercion. The fascists, of course, are insanely violent. The historian Richard Evans has a great article that really details, the intense coercion that the Nazis used over the course of their time in power. But it's also true that the fascists had real mass support as well. Right? The last sort of question that I want to raise relates to the nature of the crisis, right? We talked previously about what the historian Jeffrey Ely calls fascism-inducing crises. And we talked about how historically these crises were sort of simultaneously economic and geopolitical. And the depth of these crises, the intensity of these crises, were something that's quite different from what we see across much of the world today, where even something like COVID didn't exactly shatter the foundations of the capitalist economy. A number of questions that come to mind for me is, do these fascism-inducing crises have to be sort of these deep economic depressions or intense global wars? Could the crises be environmental, something like climate change? Certainly, I think we'll look back in 20 years, and a number of scholars are already doing so, and we'll see the pandemic as one moment in time where sort of far-right forces really gain momentum. But the question that really keeps me up at night is whether or not the crisis even has to be real. Right? In this moment, social media, of AI-generated slop, right? Must there be an actual sort of objective material crisis? Or is it enough to convince a segment of the population that there's some sort of social force or something going on in the world that's threatening to the nation? Right? Something that makes me feel better, perhaps, in certain respects today. Unlike in the 1920s and 30s, the social of today is fractured in 1,000 tiny pieces. We have the proliferation of these online subcultures that appeal to a tiny sort of niche of the population. And it's a real open question of whether or not the sort of civil society that develops in online spaces could generate the mass mobilizations and collective consciousness that we saw during sort of classical fascism of the 1920s and 30s. One thing that seems clear enough to me is that the crisis, perceived or real, has to be severe enough to convince a sizable segment of the population that there's something profoundly wrong with the status quo. Two of the crises that Jeffrey Eli talks about are what he calls a crisis of legitimacy, right? Which is a sense that the state no longer functions, no longer can possibly fulfill the needs and wishes of the people. And certainly this crisis of legitimacy, I think there's a lot of evidence that this exists today in many countries of the world. In the US, for instance, faith in institutions in political institutions is absolutely abysmal. And the second crisis that he talks about is he refers to as a crisis of social cohesion. The sort of social ties that once bound us together in a society have fragmented to such an extent that people no longer trust one another, or that people think of their fellow citizens as enemies. And again, I think that there's significant evidence that we do face a crisis of social cohesion as well. So, do we have fascism today? Does it make sense to think about the sort of far right movements, parties, leaders of today through the prism of fascism? This is a question that I'll address in another video, but hopefully with a clear definition that I've given you here, you can kind of answer this for yourself. So thanks for listening.